Okay, so like ever get the feeling that some countries just, asterisk work asterisk better than others?
Hmm. I see where you're going with this.
It's like, how did Denmark become asterisk? Denmark asterisk what's their secret sauce?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
And luckily for us, we've got Francis Fukuyama's Political Order and Political Decay to help us unpack that. We're doing a deep dive into this today.
Buckle up, because Fukuyama doesn't hold back. He basically says there's no one-size-fits-all answer, no magic shortcut to becoming a perfect Denmark.
Right, he even calls that out specifically, doesn't he? What was it, the getting to Denmark problem?
Exactly. And one of his big arguments is that strong political institutions, they're the real key.
Even more so than just like economics.
Often, yes. He argues that institutions matter, even more asterisk than a country's size or natural resources.
So basically, it's less about what you've got and more about how you use it.
That's a good way to put it. It's about having the right systems in place.
Give me an example. What kind of systems are we talking about?
Well, take geography, for instance.
Hmm.
Might not sound very political, right? Mountains, rivers, coastlines.
Right, not exactly the first thing that comes to mind.
But Fukuyama says geography has played a huge role in shaping political systems throughout history.
Okay, so geography influencing history, sure, I get that. But how does that actually asterisk affect asterisk how governments work?
Think of it this way. Europe, with all its jagged coastlines, mountain ranges, peninsulas, it naturally fractured into all these relatively small competitive states.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this.
That constant jostling for power, the need to outmaneuver your neighbor, it basically forced those states to develop strong, centralized institutions.
It's like Europe's geography accidentally invented strong states.
You could almost say that, yes. And he contrasts that with, say, sprawling empires, where projecting power over vast distances was the main challenge.
Right, like Genghis Khan versus, I don't know, the King of France. One's constantly on horseback, the other's building palaces.
Exactly. Totally different styles of power, and that shapes the whole system.
And probably leads to very different levels of bureaucracy, too. Does Fukuyama get into any asterisk-specific asterisk examples of this geography-politics link?
He does. One example he uses is the sugar trade and its impact on colonial institutions.
Sugar. Okay, that's an interesting one. Tell me more.
So, Caribbean sugar plantations, they were most efficient at a relatively small scale, didn't need a huge centralized state apparatus to run things.
But small scale doesn't always mean efficient, right? Especially not in this context.
Sadly, you're right. This small-scale model went hand in hand with the horrors of slavery. European powers, instead of building up strong local institutions, they created these brutal systems of exploitation, all about profit.
It's a chilling reminder of how economic forces can totally warp political development.
And tragically, the legacy of those extractive institutions still affects those regions today.
It's a lot to think about. But even if a country has a decent geographical hand, no history of slavery, Fukuyama says there's this other insidious force that can mess things up.
Clientelism.
Ah, yes, clientelism, the you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours approach to government. But like on a societal scale.
Exactly. Instead of citizens relating to the government based on rights, responsibilities, the rule of law, it all becomes about favors and who you know.
Not exactly the recipe for a strong, impartial state. Does he have examples of where this goes really wrong?
He looks at Greece and southern Italy. Tons of history, rich cultures.
Sure, but
But also deeply ingrained clientelism, and it's eroded trust in government. Creates this vicious cycle where everyone just assumes the system is rigged, so they game it for personal gain instead of working for the common good.
it's like everyone's playing their own little game, not realizing they're all on the same team. What's the long-term impact of that?
Stagnation, for one. Why invest in public goods like education or infrastructure when you can just call in a favor to get your kid into the best school or bypass that broken-down bridge?
It's like that saying, a society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. But with clientelism, everyone's just grabbing the nearest fruit, even if it means the whole tree withers.
Precisely. And that short-term thinking makes it really hard to break free from that cycle of decay.
What I find interesting, though, is that even the U.S., with our whole emphasis on democracy and individual rights, we weren't immune to this, right? Didn't we have our own struggles with political machines?
We absolutely did. And they were more organized and influential than many people realize.
More than just backroom deals and a bit of corruption.
Oh, much more. Think of Tammany Hall in New York City, a classic example. This wasn't just a few crooked politicians. These were well-oiled machines.
So how did they get so much power? Was it just straight up corruption?
It was more complex than that. See, these machines often filled a void. They provided services that a young and underdeveloped welfare state didn't. So they might help you navigate bureaucratic hurdles, find a job, or even deliver coal in the winter.
And in return, you vote the way they tell you to.
You got it, consolidating their power.
It's a good reminder that people have immediate needs. If the state seems distant, unresponsive, those bags of coal and promises of jobs start looking pretty good.
Exactly. And that's why tackling clientelism, it requires more than just, say, anti-corruption campaigns. It's about building trust in institutions, proving to people that the system can actually work for everyone, and not just a select few. But, as we'll see with the American puzzle, that's often easier said than done.
Speaking of easier said than done, how does a country like the US, right, with this deep suspicion of big government, how do we even function?
That's a good question.
Fukuyama calls this the American puzzle, right? What is so puzzling about us?
Well, you've got to think about it like that. We broke away from a monarchy, right? So when it came time to design our own system, let's just say the Founding Fathers, they weren't exactly fans of concentrated power.
They were like checks and balances on top of checks and balances. I
Exactly.
think.
They were taking absolutely no chances.
They were not messing around.
Nope. So that's created this system where individual liberty, it's fiercely protected, which is great, but it's also really prone to what Fukuyama calls vetocracy.
Vetocracy, I like that.
Basically, too many players with the power to block action. You get gridlock inefficiency.
So it's like the government's stuck in park. Too busy trying to block each other to actually steer the country.
That's a good way to put it.
I see where the puzzle comes in.
And Fukuyama uses some really interesting examples to illustrate this. One that he talks about is the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC.
Okay, the ICC, what was their deal?
So they were created to regulate the railroad industry.
Which back then was kind of like the Wild West, right?
Exactly. It was a free-for-all. So someone had to lay down some tracks for, a functioning economy.
Makes sense.
But the way the ICC was structured made it vulnerable to the very problems it was supposed to solve.
Now, how?
Well, they had this balanced board of party appointees, right? And then limited executive power. So it got bogged down in political maneuvering and legal battles. The ICC, it shows how this American fear of a strong government can sometimes backfire, making problems worse instead of better.
So good intentions, but too much caution.
Yeah, and Fukuyama contrasts that with another case study. He looks at the U.S. Forest Service.
Okay, the Forest Service, they're the ones who manage all those vast American forests, right?
More than just planting trees, they were and still are considered a model of a well-functioning bureaucracy, led by true believers in conservation.
People who really walk the walk.
Absolutely. And they understood that to protect those forests, they couldn't just hide in their offices writing reports.
They had to play the political game, too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They built alliances, educated the public, actively shaped the narrative. That's a key takeaway from Fukuyama. Building a strong state isn't just asterisk about technical expertise. It's about mastering the art of persuasion, negotiation, and public engagement.
So it's not enough to be right. You got to win hearts and minds, too.
You got it.
Which makes you wonder, then, how a country like China, with a totally different history and approach to power, how do the asterisk fit into all of this?
That's the question, isn't it? And that's exactly what Fukuyama wants us to consider. He uses China as this counterpoint to the American experience. Here you have a country with this centuries-long tradition of strong, centralized bureaucracy. It's rooted in Confucian principles, emphasis on merit order duty. It's like their recipe for good governance.
So while the U.S. is busy building walls around government power, China's building it like a well-oiled machine.
In a way, yes. And this has allowed them to achieve this incredible economic progress, even with challenges like corruption. But Fukuyama cautions that this centralized system also has its downsides.
Like what?
Well, it can be prone to authoritarianism. It can stifle individual freedoms.
Right. It's that classic trade-off, efficiency versus individual liberty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Fukuyama's not saying one system is better than the other. He wants us to understand that each country's path is shaped by its own unique history.
So no easy answers, then?
Not at all. But by studying these different approaches, we gain a better understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of each system. And hopefully we can learn from each other.
It's about understanding the nuances, not just blindly copying what seems to be working somewhere else, right? But with all this talk of decay and dysfunction, I gotta be honest, it's a little depressing. Does Fukuyama offer any solutions? Or are we just doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past?
He's not giving us like a step-by-step guide to political utopia, but he argues that by understanding the root causes of decay, we can start to address them. He says institutions aren't static. They need to adapt to new challenges, changing social conditions.
So we need to be more like those Forest Service leaders you mentioned, constantly adjusting our approach, building a broad base of support.
Exactly. And he highlights the importance of ideas and values, too. He argues that societies, they become vulnerable to decay when they cling to outdated doctrines and fail to embrace new ways of thinking.
So a little intellectual humility goes a long way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not just about elites having the right ideas. It's about empowering citizens, fostering a culture of open debate, critical thinking, holding those in power accountable.
Accountability, adaptation, open debate, it's starting to sound like a very tall order.
Building a resilient political system is no easy task. But the stakes are incredibly high, as Fukuyama reminds us. And understanding these things, we've been talking about state capacity, rule of law, accountability, social forces, all of it is crucial for navigating the challenges ahead.
Okay, so we need to be adaptable, accountable, always learning. It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
But before we let our listeners go to ponder the fate of modern democracy, I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier. You said Fukuyama argues we're in a new era of political decay, where institutions are failing to keep pace with change. What are some specific examples of that happening right now?
That's a great question, and one that deserves its own deep dive. But I think
Hmm?
one thing you'd point to is this whole world of social media, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the way information, or can I say misinformation asterisk spreads these days.
The information ecosystem has changed, hasn't it?
Completely. And that's put a real strain on our ability to have, reasoned public debate.
It's almost like everyone's building their own echo chamber.
Exactly.
Right.
And those shared facts, the things we used to kind of agree on as a society, they're getting harder to find.
Which makes it so much tougher to actually solve problems, right? Whether it's climate change inequality
Yeah.
or even just fixing that pothole down the street.
Exactly. When you can't even agree on what the problem is asterisk, how do you find a solution everyone can get behind?
It's a tough one. So we've got all this rapid change happening, right? Plus this eroding trust in institutions and this totally fragmented information landscape. If I'm being honest, it's enough to make me a little bit pessimistic about the future.
I hear you. It's easy to get bogged down in the doom and gloom.
So before we spiral into total political despair, I want to bring it back to something we talked about at the start, that provocative thought idea.
Oh, right. Fukuyama's challenge to all of us.
Exactly. He's basically saying, look at your own community, right?
Think about it through this lens he's given us.
State capacity, rule of law, accountability. Where are things out of balance? Are we lacking capacity? Is it a crisis of accountability or is it something else entirely?
He's making us work for it, isn't he?
Yeah, he really is. It's not enough to just say, oh, the government's the problem. We have to be more specific, more analytical. What I find helpful, though, is that he's pushing back against those easy answers. He's challenging everyone.
He doesn't let anyone off the hook, does he?
Nope, not at all. He's pushing for clear-eyed analysis, a willingness to learn from our mistakes and from our successes.
It's a breath of fresh air, isn't it? That intellectual honesty.
It really is. So where do we even begin to tackle all of this? We're not all political scientists or policymakers. Should we all just go read more history books?
A little history never hurt anyone. But I think the bigger takeaway here is that we all have skin in the game, right? This isn't just about academics debating theories.
It's about our lives, our communities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We all have a role to play in strengthening our political systems. And it's not just about voting every few years.
So what can we do day to day? I mean,
Be informed, be engaged, hold our leaders accountable at all levels of government.
and maybe even, run for office ourselves.
Hey, if you're feeling brave.
Maybe not today. But on that note, I think this deep dive has given our listeners a lot to think about.
A lot to unpack,
Yes,
sure.
definitely. But as we wrap things up here, I have this sense of not just the challenges we're facing, but also the possibility that if we approach these issues with a little more awareness, a little more humility,
A little more of that open debate we were talking about.
then maybe we can actually start to steer things in a better direction.
Well said. Couldn't agree more.